Let's bring in Dr. Raywat Deonandan. He is the epidemiologist, science communicator at the U of O. He is constantly the go-to guy when it comes to things. Dr. Ray, good morning. Good to talk to you.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well. Thank you. How are you doing?
I'm pretty good.
More importantly, what are you expecting from the Premier today? Are you worried or are you excited like the rest of us?
I'm always excited. I mean, I'm an optimist, and I've seen things curve towards the good the last few days and weeks. So I think good news is on the horizon.
How good? Are we going to see... Are you a optimist at heart, or are you like to err on the side of caution when it comes to kids and pandemic?
Wow, I'm an optimist at heart, but when it comes to kids, I err on the side of caution. So when it comes to things like opening schools, I don't think there's a lot of evidence that we need to do that yet. I understand there is a balancing act. If we open up parts of the economy, we need to also provide for childcare, and that means some kind of a school infrastructure for the very young. The science is unclear what that means. I'll be curious to see what the Premier's take on it is.
You know, it's interesting because a lot of people are saying there's a mental health issue that we have to take into consideration when it comes to our kids right now. A lot of them just want their lives back, desperate to go back to school. I never thought I'd say those words, but it's a unique situation. How much leverage should be on the long-term mental health aspects here and getting them back to normal, in your opinion?
I mean, that's important. We have to keep in mind, though, that we've only been at this for about 6 weeks. That's not a long time. And we can probably sustain a few more weeks of this before doing profound damage to people's psychologies and the economy. So let's keep the scale in mind. It's hard for us to remember when things were normal. We think of it as being months or years ago. It was literally weeks ago.
Yeah.
So let's just get settled in and look at the grand scale of things. It's impossible to know what the long-term impacts are going to be on people's mental health or their pocketbooks. What we do know is what the immediate impacts are going to be on your actual physical health if we do this wrong.
Yeah.
So let's deal with what we know, and let's not try to quantify what we don't know quite yet.
And if Quebec goes one way and we go the other, we're the conservative, they're the liberal, do we shut down the border, in your opinion, right across the bridges?
I think we should consider that. I think what we're experiencing here is a live, natural experiment, as we like to call it. And it's unfortunate that the stakes are so high. But the best way to run a natural experiment is to control as many of the variables as possible, and that includes the flow of people. So from a scientific perspective, if we can limit that interaction of pools of people, we can get a better idea of which strategy is in fact the right one.
And as we've been watching, we being the public, the numbers and waiting for the advice from people like you, you've also been watching it evolve in terms of, symptoms. A month ago, when the country went into lockdown to prepare for the first wave, you meaning you, the population of those we're counting on in medicine, thought you had a pretty good inkling of what was happening. But since then, things have really changed from symptoms to treatments, right?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't really have a good inkling of what was happening. We knew the data from China, which was quite honestly limited.
Yeah.
And we knew that as it entered Europe and then moved to North America, it was changing. And it was changing who it was affecting and what the underlying conditions that created sensitivities and vulnerabilities were. At first, we thought it was all about the elderly and kinds of pneumonia, because that's how it was originally diagnosed, as a new kind of pneumonia. And then it was maybe the middle-aged, the obese. By the time we got to America, it was the younger set who had some underlying unwellness. The way the symptoms are manifesting is complicated, because what's actually happening, for the most part, is the virus doesn't kill you. It's your immune reaction to the virus that kills you, which is one of the reasons that children don't seem to be as affected, because their immune systems aren't quite as mature. They haven't got that ability to overwhelm themselves for the most part. So even things like the pneumonia, that's the result of this thing we call the cytokine storm, this release of immunity triggers and signals that overwhelm the body. And with the stroke and heart attack issues, that's the result of blood clotting. And we saw that in China as well with coagulation issues. So one of the crises in this larger crisis is the crisis of information sharing and navigating through all the noise to get to the signal. And we're getting there, but there's so much information coming out of various pockets of outbreaks and clinical reports that we need to parse through it carefully to figure out what are the real signals here that we can take action on at the clinical level. We're getting there. We're getting there.
But what was the biggest surprise for you since this became part of your daily routine?
The biggest surprise was, To be honest, I was surprised by the degree of infectiousness. I did not think it was going to be this infectious.
Wow.
I did not think it was going to be this amount of asymptomatic transmission, and that was a little surprising. I knew some of it was happening, but not as much as it turned out. The ways in which young people are affected is a bit surprising. When it got to North America, I did expect the obese to be particularly victimized. I didn't expect other kinds of vulnerabilities, like smokers or asthmatics or things like that. So it's becoming more difficult to predict who is at greater risk. We're finding that maybe some genetic predisposition is at play here as well. Maybe there's one study that suggests that your blood type is relevant. All these things are possible. So the long and short of it is that some people are more susceptible to a bad experience than other people. And the variables that distinguish that first group from the second group are still evolving.
It's interesting. I've never heard the blood type factor before.
I wouldn't hang a lot of weight on it. It's one study.
Okay.
But we're in one of the casualties of this crisis is scientific credibility and rational thought. A lot of stuff is streaming at us that's pre-peer reviewed, that gets published in the media and amplified on social media, that we then have to take several weeks to process and make sure that it's proper. So that might be one of those studies.
There's an excellent article in New York Magazine that kind of summarizes where we are, and the headline is, "We still don't know how the coronavirus is killing us." Would you agree?
Yeah, I read that, and I don't entirely agree. The title is a bit inciting.
Yeah.
We know how it's killing us. It's killing us with an enormous immune response that manifests in a variety of ways, including cytokine storm, including pneumonia, including blood coagulation. What we don't know is what the actual factors of vulnerability are for most people. Well, not for most people, but for all people. For most people, it's still the elderly. And it's still the immunocompromised, and it's still the obese and the diabetic. But it's that fraction that's not on that group that is still vulnerable that we're still trying to explore. And that complicates how we develop therapies and treatments, and possibly how eventually we deploy a vaccine.
Are you among those who say that the long-term care system in this country, never mind province, but specifically the province, was broken before this?
100%.
So if it weren't broken and we had taken the proper measures that were in place as standard, given, the system we have failed, do you think we'd see many more lives saved, or because they're so vulnerable, the minute it gets in there, it's hard to stop?
I'm disappointed. I thought from day one we understood that population, the long-term care population, was the most vulnerable. And if this disease gets into our population, that's the group we've got to stand firm and protect. So I thought we'd be deploying our testing regimen rigorously through all the residents and all the workers. That's not what we did. So I'm deeply disappointed about our public health response when it comes to those residential populations. I will say, though, that the entire world had exactly the same experience.
That's why I was asking it, because it's easy to say the system was broken before going into it, but maybe is it possible the systems have been broken everywhere? That's
exactly right. We as a species, we have gotten to this point where we don't value our elderly as much as we should.
Although it's cultural. Like, for example, in Latin America, I don't know the numbers, and if you have them offhand, but are they having a greater survival rate among the older population because they do respect their elders so much more?
I don't know, and that will come down to how much of that population is institutionalized.
That's the other thing. They don't have access to health care the same way we do.
That's right, and the data is not good either.
And that's the frustrating thing here for us, right, is we know we've got among the best medicine in the world, access to. There are always faults to it, but that we dropped the ball on the most vulnerable, knowing going into this.
You're exactly right. No, that's exactly right. It's really frustrating. And you don't need to be a clairvoyant or a telepath or a fortune teller to have foreseen that this would happen. And the second that we knew there's asymptomatic carrying, the second that we knew that this thing had a high reproduction number, meaning it was very transmissible, and a high mortality rate amongst the elderly, we should have shut down all visitation to long-term care facilities. We should have ensured that workers only worked in one facility and not multiple ones. We should have tested everyone in those facilities and then isolated those who were infectious and then contact traced heavily. We should have prevented visitors coming back from spring break from going to see their grandparents, which is possibly how much of this started. These are things that were foreseeable. And my opinion of what ethical behavior is that you are ethically responsible for the foreseeable consequences of your actions. this was foreseeable, so we're responsible for it. Other things are not that foreseeable. We didn't foresee, for example, that much that the U.S. border would have been as porous and a great source of infection as it turned out to be. So I'm more forgiving on that sort of thing. But our inability to care for our elderly is really going to be one of the big takeaways when this is all over, and hopefully we have a national conversation about that failure.
A public inquiry back in the old days when we used to have RCMP inquiries, whatever you want to call it, I agree with you 100%, because otherwise it was all for naught. Yeah. In terms of failing our elderly population. There's no reason we should find ourselves in this boat again, given the experience we're now living. That being said, the final question for you, doctors. I know you're busy, and you've been very generous. Appreciate your time. South of the border, injection Clorox coming from the top? I mean, does it worry that we're so close to them?
I'm fond of saying that the only way to inoculate the world against bad ideas is proper public education. And I think that has failed in the U.S. to a large extent. I'm a bit more sanguine about our public education abilities in Canada. So I'm not worried about those bad ideas infecting us as much as others might be, because we have people like you in the media who are helping to spread the word of, the truth, the scientific truth, in as much as we know it. But it doesn't help when your leader is amplifying non-scientific, dangerous pseudoscience.
And yet he still has a lot of support.
Yeah.
That's a whole other topic. I'll let you get back to work. Dr. Raywat Deonandan, epidemiologist, science communicator, U of O. Thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. Bye.